My name is Diego Tovar. I'm a second-year student here at CSU. I'm majoring in ecosystem science and sustainability, and I have minors in political communication and environmental affairs. I'm also the current president of MANRRS, also known as Minorities in Agriculture, Natural Resources, and Related Sciences. MANRRS provides students with professional development training, enhances leadership skills, provides volunteering, and creates a community of friends. MANRRS acts as a springboard that launches members into the professional world. Professionally, I'm passionate about leading an effort in environmental justice to provide equitable communities. I'm fascinated by the depth of sustainability in our ecosystems and how it relates to our everyday lives. I seek a career in understanding the importance of environmental justice through working on legislation relating to health, safety, and civil rights. Now I'd like to introduce you to the moderator of today's first panel session, Kristen Kirkpatrick, Executive Director of Together We Grow, CSU Center for an Enhanced Workforce in Agribusiness. In this role, Kristen works alongside a consortium of industry, NGO, higher ed, and government institutions to create a more skilled, diverse, and inclusive workforce within the American ag industry. Kristen has always had a passion for public health, public advocacy, and community planning. Most recently, she directed the Colorado Regional Office of Kimball Musk's national nonprofit Big Green, which integrates food literacy into education into school curriculum across the country. Welcome, Ms. Kirkpatrick.
All right, before I introduce our panelists, I wanted to give each of you an opportunity to connect at your tables. As we know, we aren't going to be successful in the aims that we have building diverse and inclusive thought partners, workplaces, universities, without the participation of everybody in this room. And so I want to give you just a couple of quick minutes to say hi to your neighbor, and if you don't have one, to turn around and find one at another table. And just talk about your experience with these topics and what you hope to get out of the session today. All right, if you have had a chance to meet your neighbor, I'm going to invite you to learn more about our amazing panelists. And as I start to introduce them, I'm going to invite them up onto stage right now. Our first panelist is Erin Fitzgerald. Erin serves as the Chief Executive Officer of the U.S. Farmers and Ranchers Alliance, a farmer and rancher-led organization committed to encouraging inclusive stakeholder and consumer dialogue about how food is both grown and raised. She's going to be showing an amazing video after this panel that I think will really help to set the tone for the kind of work that they're doing. She's been recognized as a White House champion of change for sustainable and climate-smart agriculture, and is also an Aspen Institute First Movers Fellow. Philomena Morrissey Satre is the Director of Diversity and Inclusion and also External Strategic Partnerships at Land of Lakes. Philomena joined Land of Lakes in 2017 and brings more than 30 years of human resource experience in diversity and inclusion, community relations, and work life and well-being. Before joining Land of Lakes, she worked for Wells Fargo. Dr. Quentin Tyler is the Associate Dean and Director for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the College of Agriculture and Natural Resources at Michigan State University. In his role, Quentin provides leadership for infusing diversity, equity, and inclusion principles through all areas of the college. Prior to MSU, Dr. Tyler spent more than 13 years in the area of diversity, equity, and inclusion at the University of Kentucky College of Agriculture. Dr. Tyler is also the 2015-2016 National Professional President for MANRRS, and you just heard from CSU's own student chapter president, Diego. MANRRS stands for Minorities in Agriculture, Natural Resources, and Related Sciences, and he's currently the National MANRRS Advisory Board Chair as well. So will you please help me in welcoming our panelists? So is this on? All right. To get started, I'm hoping that we can start by discussing how each of you found yourself in this line of work, and if there were personal experiences that made you realize the value of creating inclusive workplaces or campus communities.
So for me, I did not grow up in agriculture. I grew up in a small town, Flag City, USA, Findlay, Ohio, and I couldn't wait to get out of that small town. When I graduated college, I did not know that there was this thing called agriculture. And I say agra as a culture. And I was transferred to live in Paris, France for 4 years. And I moved back, and I just struggled in a startup at that time, and was just reading all these books about purpose and finding purpose-driven business models. And I felt like the American culture did not really appreciate, like the French people did, food and where food comes from in small communities. And I was desperate to find and make a career change from healthcare and finance to food and ag. And you never know where your life takes you. Sometimes you meet acquainted strangers. I was on an elevator getting off of my miserable job every day, and I kept saying hi to this gentleman, and he got off, and later I went to an event called Finding Life's Purpose, and guess who's speaking? And I said, you need to get me a job. He's like, well, I know this guy named Tom Gallagher at the dairy industry. And I said, great, I like milk and cheese, get me a job. And that started my love and passion for food and ag, and also the notion of sustainability, that we can do agriculture is more than just what's on your plate.
Good morning, everyone. I'll say I got into this work of diversity and inclusion. I'm going to give a nod to my mom. And she is an immigrant from Ireland and came to Minnesota at age 16. And so raising our family, we have Irish on both sides. My dad's grandparents immigrated from Ireland as well. It was really important to her to retain the Irish culture within our family. And so we did a lot within the community. She also was a big activist, and also really important that we volunteered as a family. I'm one of 7 kids. So she would haul us on the city bus around, and we're like, Mom, why do we have to do this? No one else is doing it. And so I think it was in my blood from that. I was a public and then poli-sci major, so my big dream was to work in government and do public policy work, and then I did an internship, and that kind of squashed my government dream, but then went into business, working in HR, and so that, just all the different work around culture, recruitment, retention, how do we get people to stay and do their best work? And then I'm a mom of 3, and when our third was born, my manager said, Philomena, what do you think about doing this community outreach role? When I worked at Wells Fargo, you love the community, you're engaged. We have a couple of employee resource groups, a diversity council. We don't quite know what to do, and that was my entree.
So good morning. I'm definitely glad to be here, representing Michigan State and MANRRS. So I know every person out there has this one person in which they call a mentor, right? And that's how we got to where we at. And I look at a mentor as an individual that sees things in us that we don't necessarily see in ourselves. And I was fortunate, at the University of Kentucky College of Ag, to have Lionel Williamson, who was a professor, be my mentor. Now this mentor, when I went to his class, he would always call on me, and I was sitting in that back room and I was like, not today. But he kept calling on me. And then, he noticed that, I came from a rural area in Kentucky. I majored in agricultural economics, and also I was very good with people. So the opportunity came when he was announced assistant dean at the University of Kentucky. He invited me in to work on a NEFM, and one of the greatest mentors I've had. But dating previous to that, growing up in Kentucky, I always had an interest in agriculture. But, I didn't grow up on a farm. But again, a farmer introduced me to my major, and he told me to go talk to another professor at that time. And when I did, that professor welcomed me in and gave me a job working in the department. So one of my tasks in that department, as we know, was carrying papers. And being from, Hopkinsville, we do everything with pride. So if you know anything about the Ag College, we're a mile located away from central part of campus. And one specific day, I had to deliver papers. And so I was walking that mile and I was smiling because in Hopkinsville, we always have a smile on our face. And when I got there, I decided to go through a back, way. And being from Hopkinsville, I always wave at everybody, and I was waving. And I saw some folks, and I was waving, and again, and actually I saw, a picture on the wall. And I saw that picture on the wall, and I looked at it. I said, okay. And I dropped my papers off, and I looked at my watch. And the students, we always have 10 minutes. We got to check our emails. So I went and checked my emails. And then, interesting enough, a certain officer came by and said, hey, he looked at me. And being from Hopkinsville, I waved at him. And he gave me the head nod, and he kept going. And then he came back again and said, hey, you, come here. And I said, okay. He said, just show me your ID. And when I showed him my ID, he said, okay, you're good. And then when I started my journey back to ag, I started thinking about it. That picture on the wall was actually a mugshot. And what happened was somebody called the police on me. And all I was doing was an 18-year-old student, 3.5 hours away from home, and was just trying to deliver papers. And when I came back to my department, at that time, those individuals said, hey, keep in mind I had tears in my eyes, and they was like, you'll be okay. So I went back in my cubicle, and I sit there, and I went to talk to this professor, and he comforted me. And he asked questions about that. And to me, that was my intrinsic motivation to do this work. I wasn't, again, mad at the police officer because they were doing their work. But I was more upset about the fact that those folks within my department didn't ask me questions and didn't show empathy. So I decided at that very point, I wanted to do something about that and do learning and development, how we can handle these situations and have courageous conversations. So that's my why and how I got into this work.
That's such a powerful why. And Quentin, I think it leads right into our next question, which is, what are we talking about when we're talking about diversity, equity, and building inclusive cultures?
See everybody looking at me. So.
No, she said she asked you first.
So I look at it as, diversity, a lot of times I ask people this question, and I tend to think of it and I define it as differences among human characteristics, but also differences in terms of how we communicate. And when we think about diversity on a broad scale, my approach is always to the point where everybody's involved in this. I don't look at diversity as excluding anybody, and I always have the conversations that we need everybody to make this possible. And then also how I define equity is giving everybody what they need to be successful. And people that know me, there's this golden rule that means treat people how they need to be treated, and then there's the platinum rule, golden rule is treat people how you want to be treated, and the platinum rule is treat people how they need to be treated. And I believe in treating people how they need to be treated. And that's what another point. And then also inclusion to me is leveraging that diversity to a point where every voice is heard. And that looks like many different things to many different people. And I think we also collaboratively, as a college, as an organization, as a society, as a field, we have to work together to provide solutions to make that happen.
So I have a visual at Land O'Lakes that I show when I do some training or learning around diversity and inclusion, and it's an eye. So the middle of the eye is looking at personality. So if you think about introvert or extrovert or ambivert, because that is a determinant, right, in how we operate in the world, how we see the world. And then looking at those primary dimensions of diversity. So man, woman, sexual orientation, some of those different things that make up who we are that are core, those primary dimensions of diversity. But then also there's those secondary dimensions. It could be regional. So there are definite unique differences, aren't there? So if you relocate from the South to the Midwest, from the Midwest to the West to the East, geographic differences. If you're a first generation college student, I am one. And so that was a whole learning, right? So some of those things. Then on the outside of the eye are cultural dimensions of diversity. And that's often where clashes happen. So you had talked a little bit, Quentin, about communication. So do you have a direct communication style, indirect communication style? What are some of those unique differences, like sense of time? So I say I grew up in an Irish family where there are all degrees of late. So when I have a family party, I have to think, okay, Sean's usually an hour late, more is a half an hour. Do you get the idea? And how do we approach that? Now, guess what, team? I married into a Norwegian family. They are early. That would never happen in my family. But when we go into the workplace, we walk into the workplace with all these different messages, ways that we grew up, values, things that are important to us, and maybe similar or different from the people that we work with. So how do we create this environment, as Quentin was saying, where we value, where we respect, where voices can be heard? And if voices aren't being heard, are we aware to say, we haven't heard from you yet, Erin. What are you thinking about, right? And so, or people who aren't in the room. You know, in so many of our organizations now, we live in a virtual world. So are we only paying attention to what happens with people who are physically in that meeting? Are we aware of who might be out there that has something to be said, but we need to create space for that?
We got to go to our Irish families together. But, you know, I think about values-based conversations. And so I got into sustainability really from a business mindset and very quickly realized from our farmers that there was this bigger thing called stewardship. And so stewardship, I think, are the values and the commitment, a shared purpose to leave this land better for the next generation. Then sustainability is about putting those values to work. Having met many of my sustainability colleagues, often they're setting these goals and the business models and the structures for the business aspect, but often overlooking the values-based conversation, the peoples-based conversation of creating that movement. So I'm very big, I think sustainability is the greatest challenge of our time. It necessitates contagious collaboration. And so you have to look at the strengths of the system and the people in that system, and it has to be multi-stakeholder. It has to include every voice, and really work hard. I have a systems map of every type of stakeholder that can influence the conversation, every type of leader, every type of academic, to make certain that, and diversity and diversity of intellect as well. Are they a collaborator, are they introvert? And we choose people specifically to engage in topics based on that multi-stakeholder, specifically focused on what can they do to build from their strengths to align towards a common and shared goal. Because everyone has a strength to offer to the system, but how do you get them to put that strength forward is something I think a lot about.
I think, Erin, that you touched on the huge pressing challenges facing this industry over the next 30 years. And I think as many companies and universities move to really push on their diversity, inclusion, and equity initiatives, it is because they know that diversity of thought makes us run more profitable businesses. It helps us come up with better ideas. It really drives innovation, which is the topic of this conference. And so I'm curious, you all represent different cultural organizations. And so the Farmers and Ranchers Alliance, a giant corporation, the university settings. I'm curious how you make the case for diversity in your organizations, and what do you think are the most effective ways that people in this room can make the case in theirs, and what successes, what traction you're getting in making the case. Erin, do you want to start?
Okay, sure, I'll go start. You know, tracking success of people-based movements is tricky. Tracking success of mindset is tricky. But I would say this. I think that this topic, and you'll hear me say this over and over, is one of our greatest challenges of the time. And we tend to often focus just in the ag sector. And you know, Rob was talking about this, where the 2% of people who farm today are the 1% I always hear, and there are these other people who don't get us. I'm like, well, who are these others? It's like that Dr. Seuss book, the who-tos, the you-tos, and the others, I think it goes. And that's an old, everyone knows that that's not a good inclusive diversity mindset. And that's also not a place of leadership, and that's not a place of inclusiveness. And you know, when I think about people-based movements, I really want to challenge that status quo. And if you add up people who could actually make a difference and would live this every single day, those are people who probably are in the food and ag sector. Those are our employees. Those are our colleagues. And that's 15% of the American workforce. And what if they were just mobilized beyond belief toward mission-driven outcomes and shared outcomes, and were willing to do anything to work with their colleagues towards that shared mission and put everything aside? Like, that's what gets me fired up, saying, Okay, bring it on. And we need more than just the food and ag sector. We need the innovators, the scientists. We need, people. I've been talking to, machine learning folks. Or I just today met a wonderful student in the lobby, and I'm like, what are you doing? We were just making small talk. And he's like, I'm a filmmaker. I said, oh, you're a filmmaker. What type of filmmakers do you want to do? He's like, I want to do environmental film. I said, have you ever thought about a job in agriculture? And he said, why would agriculture? I said, well, we're 48% of the land mass in the United States. There's some beautiful shots. And so just asking people to help, I think, is in asking for the diversity of thought and every hand on deck, really.
Love that. So business case for diversity and inclusion, at Land O'Lakes, we kind of break it into 3 focus areas. And what I've seen, having been in this field 21 years, is there's been a movement. So initially, it was all about workforce, if I go back 21 years ago. So that's our first pillar at Land O'Lakes for diversity and inclusion. So it's all about recruitment. So how do we build this brand so that people in ag or maybe are not familiar with ag or dairy would want to work for Land O'Lakes, and building great partnerships with MANRRS. So for right out of college, for experienced employees. And our tagline for that is really going after broadly how to do this across the country, because we have a headquarters, we have people who work in our plants, who work directly with our members. The unemployment rate is 3.6% in the U.S., and so if we want to attract the best talent, we have to have a broad talent pool. Our second pillar is workplace. So how does it feel when you're here? So that's all about culture, right? So we can do all this work on recruitment, but if we're not creating that culture where people are going to want to stay and grow their career and tell their friends and colleagues to come and work with us. And then our third pillar is marketplace. So it has the business component. So what do we do, like from a supplier diversity perspective, from an innovation perspective, as we reach out to new customers? And then it also has a community component. So you were talking about, Erin, that importance of purpose. How do our employees want to make a difference in the communities where they live and work? And so how do we do that? Through volunteerism and giving. And so that's kind of how we frame it up and then look to measure in those different areas.
So I definitely, appreciate, the business case, and I believe in that as well. But I think, a couple years ago when I was national president, I had the opportunity to attend a meeting in D.C. And basically, one of the key things that stuck with me was that I think every year within this industry, 35,000 jobs goes unfilled. So that makes me think about, all this talent out there that's untapped. So that's what I think about. You think about the browning of America, the demographic change. You think about just even recently, within the last couple of years, over 58% of degrees awarded were to women. You have that avenue. And I think also, too, is that, we talk about the business case, but a lot of times we forget the moral case. As a land-grant institution, our purpose is to serve all people, provide opportunities for all, and then also to maximize human potential. And we can do that if we're in a space where we truly feel involved. And I think about my situations. I've been at 2 institutions, and it was a pride I had for those institutions. Those late nights where I was advising MANRRS students, those late nights where I was working on extension review in Kentucky. It's because I love my institution and I love my industry. And the reason being is because folks allowed me to be there. They empowered me. I have folks that when I come in, they smile at me. I have folks when I come in, they wave at me. I have folks that when I come in to ask, when I had a death in the family, Quentin, how are you doing? And that's what I talk about, the moral case, actually caring about people. And that's one of the reasons why I truly love this industry, because that's what we're all about.
I love that. I feel like you guys set it up exactly the way I was hoping. Will you guys help us understand specifically what that means? So what kind of initiatives are you launching to really advance both the business and the moral case for diversity, equity, and inclusion? Philomena, do you want to start?
Yeah. I'll start. So recruitment, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about our amazing partnership with MANRRS. So I think it's been 5 or 6 years, or maybe just slightly more, that Land O'Lakes started a relationship with MANRRS. And it started out small. We hired 4 interns from MANRRS, if I have my facts right, Quentin. And then what happened is we found amazing students and built out a structure to support that. So we have one of our senior leaders who runs our feed business, who's the executive sponsor, Dave Hogemood, and he has been amazing in not only helping drive our partnership with MANRRS and influence other business lines to step in and make a commitment. Last summer, we hired 25 MANRRS interns. We're a titanium sponsor. I didn't even know there was such a thing. And as a result of that partnership, we are going to be hosting the National MANRRS Conference in the Twin Cities. And so we're super excited because we're going to be able to rally a lot of new organizations that are not familiar with MANRRS that are located in the Twin Cities to be a supporter. So that's an example of that. In the workplace model, I'm going to talk a little bit about the voice of people who work in our plants. So in many of our organizations and at Land O'Lakes, a lot of attention is paid to people who work at corporate headquarters. A lot of the programming is designed for someone who has flexibility in their job. But for those of you that are familiar with plants, you know they don't have a lot of time. So year 1, I focused on headquarters. Year 2, people beyond headquarters. So we piloted a new learning in our Tulare plant, which is our largest dairy plant in California. It's called bite-sized learning. And I love it. It's 15 minutes or less. We train the supervisors and managers to be the teachers of the DNI learning. 5 different modules, 1 per month. We had a design team from our Tulare plant who helped us with curriculum, working with the Mind Gym, and one of their specialties is this short learning. And they were like, okay, Philomena, throw out that picture. That language doesn't work. Like, let's simplify it. And powerful. I also asked people, our HR team, as you see and hear stories of success, let me know, because I want to acknowledge the work that our leaders are doing. And I did, and I sent out emails, and guess what I heard back? Philomena, this is my first email from anyone in corporate. I am so honored to receive this message. And I thought, oh my gosh, we have work to do in building this community across our organization. On the marketplace, I have a few examples, but I'm going to highlight one that is close, and I think you will all agree. Our CEO last year, when all our employee resource groups gave our end-of-year impact, she gave us a challenge, Beth Ford. How can we better support our farmer owners? And so we had an opportunity to partner with the organization called NAMI, National Alliance on Mental Illness. You may be familiar with them. They have a grant in the state of Minnesota to do suicide prevention workshops. And so we got our disability awareness employee resource group, benefits, my department, member services, and worked with NAMI to design curriculum where we've gone to 2 different locations in Minnesota and have invited our co-op owners and people who touch our farmers, like the vets, faith community, bankers, to be a part of it. So that way they better have resources that are geared for people in rural communities. And now we're just figuring out how we'll scale it. And do more across the country, but that was powerful, and our farmers and the community really appreciated that.
Yeah, so as a Titanium sponsor, we appreciate the relationship we have with Land O'Lakes. They're definitely integrated and involved into our organization. So for example, a member of Land O'Lakes sits on our MANRRS advisory board, so they advise, strategic direction of our organization. In addition to that, another employee actually leads one of our strategic planning groups too. So they're definitely involved. And then also we have a great relationship in which we can be candid with our sponsors. So if we hear feedback from one of our 55 chapters in over 38 states, we relay that information to our corporate sponsors for that. Also, through the National Society of MANRRS, we have an initiative in which we call Junior MANRRS, and that focuses on K through 12 and somewhat replicated from the professional and the collegiate students, and where they come to a conference on respective campuses and they learn about agriculture and natural resources. And then also we have something where we have just ongoing conversations, candid conversations about ways to make organizations more inclusive. So that's from the MANRRS end. I'm happy to talk about a little bit about Michigan State. Again, I've been at Michigan State in March, will be 2 years. And when I first came to Michigan State, we had a leader there, and his name was Ron Hendrick. And Ron Hendrick was, very intentional in stating the importance of diversity and inclusion in our college going forward. And what he did was he had 35 of our leaders go through a leadership and inclusion training at an off-site. And that's one of the first things he did. And, just imagine a lot of folks were kind of like, I don't know what this is about. And myself included, I didn't know what it's about, because the group who we were working with was called White Men Full Diversity Partners. So to be honest with you, when I came into this job, I said, I don't know what's going on with that, Ron. But honestly, I think a lot of times in this work, to get where you want to get, you got to do things you've never done before. So each of these leaders, he dedicated funds for 35 of these leaders to go to this week training, and they talked about issues on power and privilege. So when I came into my role, around our leadership table, people were talking about power and privilege. And I was looking around like, what is this? What is going on? But I felt really good about it. They set the stage, and our leadership set the stage on this. Every conversation when we come to the table was talking about inequities that happen. They're talking about marginalized voices. So they did this. And then also, as a result, they had a reunion where they brought folks back and talked about how we're engaging in this work. So one of the things I wanted to do as a result of a partnership with the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, they provided funding for us to provide this same type of training for our faculty and staff across the college. So we had over 100 or so folks go through this in a day and a half, and we talked about power and privilege and integrating diversity, equity, and inclusion to every day of our jobs. And it was very successful, and it's one of the things that we did. And then also we have this event, we talk about college level diversity, equity, inclusion training. We have something we call Intercultural College of Ag and Natural Resources. So we talk about dimensions of diversity that you typically don't talk about. And this time we talked about spirituality. And a lot of times you don't talk about that, in a college campus, but we talked about if you're gonna bring your true self to work, you gotta talk about all aspects of diversity. So what we did was we went out to 6 different spiritual groups throughout the East Lansing community. And we talked about what we wanted to do, what type of messages, what type of myths are about your particular religion or spirituality. And then we signed up, say, 40 or 50 faculty and staff and did a mobile tour on a day. So they got to learn about each aspect of a religion and spirituality. And then the next day what we did was we had a panel. And we had other religions present and also those who do not participate in religion. Because if you think about it, our institutions are based on dominant cultural values. So how does this impact who we are as individuals and also as institutions? So it was a very productive conversation that we had in regard to that. In addition to that, what we did was we have an initiative in which we are forming community norms at the departmental level as our dean and directors group and also our chair and directors group. How do we operate? How do we treat people? For example, we have a habit during meetings, sometimes some of us, we get to yelling, right? And sometimes we get to interrupting people. So how do we operate? Who talks, who doesn't talk, and how do we treat people? So we talked about community norms. And then also within our college, we have several pre-college programs that focus on underrepresented groups. So we have one that focuses on Native American population. We also have one that focuses on the bilingual population. And we also have another that focuses on multicultural. And the unique thing about Michigan State is that we have a Native American institute that's housed within our College of Ag and Natural Resources as well. So we have a lot of different initiatives, and one of the things I'm proud to say is that our diversity, equity, inclusion efforts start at the top.
So at U.S. Farmers and Ranchers Alliance, we are 75 different farm groups and that came together, represent about 1.6 million farmers. And about 15 months ago when I came on board, the question first asked was, if we really are concerned about our future, where do all the agricultural CEOs and leaders get together to plan that future? And there was the answer was no. And then the next question was, well, where do the food leaders get together? And then the question is, of course, if we're a sector, where do we get together to plan our future? So we are focused on 3 major things. One is absolute leadership of this sector to really address what I would call the greatest challenge of our time in the next 10 years. And the second is contagious collaboration. If this is that big of a deal, which I believe it is, then it necessitates unprecedented collaboration. And then the third is culture change. that we have to be resilient, we have to be adaptive, we have got to learn and grow fast to meet these challenges, and we have to do it together. This past June, we hosted a summit with about 100 leaders. Secretary Vilsack was there and is on our advisory council, and many other organizations that really stepped up to say, let's get this started. And I think part of it is just really unleashing the potential of each organization to put their best effort forward together. You know, in agriculture, we have over 500 different acronym organizations that all work for themselves. It might be more than 500. But what are we all doing together? Mission-driven, towards a common purpose, willing to put our best resources, our best people, and our best efforts together to make a difference. We all have shared values. That I do know, and we can build from those shared values. But now it's time to put our values to work. And so that is really our mission, and you'll be hearing a lot about it this next year. I encourage everyone in this room to get involved, to figure out what you can do to help, but it's time.
I love that. I think each of you touched on the need to be changing how we have been approaching things. And since the theme of this conference is innovation, I'm curious how you connect diversity to driving innovation.
For me, it's definitely diversity of thought in different types of leaders and different types of institutions that normally never touch agriculture. So, you know, we're in conversations with MIT and other that don't have an ag institution, but have incredible expertise that combine when they're in the room with the ag experts. It's been amazing to watch. So really trying to find those, you'll hear me talk about X-Men a lot, and you'll see why. But try to find these superhero talents that if work and applied together, what would happen? And so I'm really on a mission to find these other experts and bring them into agriculture. Financial experts, as we've seen the greatest flight of capital in this sector. Who else can help us with our grand mission?
I'm going to highlight learning. I talked with you a little bit about the plant, but in our organizations, how do we create this environment and culture of inclusion? And what are those moments of exclusion? Because if someone does not feel like they belong, are a part of the team, they're not going to put their best foot forward, their voice won't be heard. So this last year, we started a DNI Learning Series. The first session we led with was an innovative mindset. How do we go from fear to discovery, and what are those behaviors? All of our sessions are offered in person with a virtual component. Our second was around unconscious bias. So within our systems, within our process, what gets in the way, right? When we're hiring, when we're developing people, when we're creating succession plans, when we're deciding who gets on projects, all those sorts of things are impacted if we have a bias, or if we're looking at, well, clearly we couldn't hire a woman. There hasn't been a woman in this role in North Dakota. Well, why not? And so that was really powerful in carrying conversation forward from that. Our third was a summit. So we're at a summit today. This was our second summit, and this was powerful because I believe people learn differently with different ways of thinking, right? Exposure. We hired an interactive theater group called Inclusion in Action. They met with us to learn about our culture, our values. What are those moments of exclusion? And then guess what, team? They acted out these different vignettes for all to see. We filmed it so people, no matter where they were in the country, could participate. We had 840 people, and people like, what? We do that? Yes, we do that, because these were real stories provided from leaders of our employee resource group. My favorite comment was with feedback. We had 50% of our participants provide feedback. I laughed. So there were hilarious parts. I cried. I learned. And it's, you know, kind of going from the head to the heart, right? And ultimately to the hands. And then our last session, we had a local photographer, amazing, Dr. Wing Young Huey, who travels the world, and he's a photographer, and had this whole array of different pictures and stories, and what do you see and what don't you see, and what do we see when we see each other, and did chalk talks so people filled out kind of here's who I am and here's who I really am, and did it around the country and provided tools and resources for our employees at remote locations around the power of belonging. And that's a big word that that has come to the surface in the diversity and inclusion world, is that piece around what does that mean? And it means something different for everyone. And so that's been an amazing effort for us, and we're getting traction and getting participation not only from headquarters but from beyond headquarters.
Yeah, so, when I think about, I've been in this work, diversity, equity, and inclusion for a while. I've been representing a couple institutions in the National Society, and I always say, you got to create experiences for folks. We all been through trainings, right? But I think true change happens when we have experiences. And I think the only way that you're going to have experiences is put folks in situations where they're uncomfortable. And we have to be comfortable being uncomfortable. And I think about it also in terms of MANRRS is that we're fortunate enough to have representation from all different aspects. We have folks that work in government. We have folks that work in higher education. We have folks that work in private industry. And that's what makes the organization great, in addition to its geographic diversity. Now, in thinking about it in terms of Michigan State, Michigan State and our College of Ag and Natural Resources, we're trying to solve complex problems. And I think in order to solve complex problems, you got to have folks from all different places. And they also have to feel comfortable enough where they can share their voices. For example, at Michigan State in our college, we recently received a grant that's looking at renewable energy options. And it focuses on 8 communities within Michigan. And 2 of those communities are Native American communities. And who was at the table for that was our Native American Institute. In addition to that, I recently saw that one of our urban foresters, a woman of color, and now she's looking at tree resiliency in urban spaces. And in addition to that, we have a racial equity, a food systems looking at racial equity. And through a partnership, we actually hired a postdoc from Tuskegee University. So again, in order to solve these problems and talking about innovation, it's important to have folks at the table that we may not have to fill in our gaps and the expertise we may not have.
I love that. So because of time, we're going to jump to our last question. And I want you guys to pay attention to the answers because we're going to give you a few minutes to connect at your own tables on the answer that you were about to give. But since we all play a role, each one of us in this room, in creating cultures that are inclusive and holding space for diversity of thought, what advice do you have for the people in this room for how they can advance the kind of diversity, equity, and inclusion we need to drive the innovation we need to solve the biggest challenges in our lifetime?
I really do believe making sure everyone's in the room, as you were saying, and really being mindful of making certain that diversity of thought is in the room, and then really bringing out the strengths of, and focusing on the strengths of that system that is now in the room, and then asking what are those shared values, those shared goals and aspirations that strength of that system can actually go work on. So that's how I think about it.
All right. We heard a reference to Mark Twain earlier. I'm a quote lady, so I've got a quote board at home to keep family focused, right, and intentional. So I'm going to start with a quote and then provide a couple of examples. So I love this quote by Desmond Tutu, and he says, "Do your little bit of good where you are." It's those little bits of good put together that will overwhelm the world. And so I see it as a daily practice, diversity and inclusion. So it's, do you see people when you go to the store and you get that gas and you talk to the cashier, right? When you hear something or see something that is not right, are you a bystander, or do you step in and be the bridge? And do you call it out respectfully and support that person? Important. What does that look like? How do you go beyond? I always talk about at Land O'Lakes, how do we go beyond our walls, and be actively involved in the community and helping solve some of these issues? How do we bring it forward in all these different aspects of life? And as we practice it daily, then it just becomes a part of who we are. So we can do it just like every single day as we're going to work in our workplaces, in our community, in our families.
So I think, we both have similar messages, and I would say success is the sum of small, consistent steps. You know, a lot of times we think of, you know, these grand, large ideas or things that we have to do, but like Philomena said, just sometimes just interrupt and bias. You know, when you see something happening, you may not have all the answers, but just say at the end of the day, I know that's not right. Or when somebody goes outside a room and they experience something negative, say, hey, are you okay? And I think that's really important. That's one of the things I appreciate, you know, about MANRRS, about, you know, our sponsors, about Michigan State, is that even if I come into the office and I have a frown on my face, and I walk out that door, somebody says, hey, I'll get a text message, are you okay? And I think that's what we got to do, be each other's champions.
I love that. So we're going to do a couple things now. If you've got questions, will you raise them so we can collect them while you discuss? And then we're going to give you just a couple minutes at your tables to discuss as a table, not just with your neighbor, some of the things you've heard here and what specifically you think you can enact, whether you're a student or in your industry or here on campus. All right, our panel would love to hear what some of your conversations have been and respond. So we're going to send around a mic right now, and if anybody would like to share some of the themes of what their table has been discussing, challenges, opportunities, we would love to know what you've been discussing. Who wants to be brave? Sure, so we're going to hear from the tables right now some of the themes of what you've been discussing. So challenges, opportunities, so go ahead.
So I applaud what you guys are doing. You have big companies, a university, and working for diversity is something that really we all need to do in our life. But I think your companies have a responsibility more to reach out into the broader community and to work for diversity in our country. And what are y'all able to do, and what do you think about that?
Oh, I love that. Who would like to respond?
I'll start. That's a really good point. So I'm located in the Twin Cities. We have a Twin Cities Diversity and Inclusion Roundtable. It started about 25 years ago with 10 people, and we now have 300 people who are a part of it. And so it's business, government, nonprofit, and secondary ed. And so kind of that, like the power of what happens when we can all work together and help each other with initiatives. So that's more of a regional. We also have in the Twin Cities a number of different regional efforts, cross organizations. How do we make the Twin Cities a destination for people of color who want to work and stay? So a lot of different efforts like that I'm involved in and people from our organization are involved in, not just in the Twin Cities, but in the country.
Yeah, so I've been a part of a lot of working groups out of Washington, D.C. I think one is the Food and Ag group. It was a couple years ago. I've been able to do that, but also within my local community. So for example, you know, we work with a lot of our external partners. So the Michigan Department of Ag and Rural Development, been involved in a lot of their conversations on DEI. I provided presentations with those folks, and also conversations and keynote speeches on in regard to diversity, equity, inclusion, and the importance of inclusive organizations. And then also a lot of our industry partners and a lot of our campus partners. So I feel like it's my responsibility to not only serve, you know, my institution and my state, but across the country as well. And then working with the Chamber of Commerce when I was at the University of Kentucky, I was involved in Leadership Lexington, leadership groups such as that. I've done presentations to leadership groups. I've done presentations to the fire department, the police department, all across the board. So I feel like it's my responsibility to, you know, have expertise in this area to work with all different groups.
So for our organization, we're kind of flipping it on the head of the diversity of solutions, particularly for climate change. And I absolutely believe that agriculture has not been considered in the solution set as for climate change. We often hear about Elon Musk and Richard Branson and all these industry CEOs, and I absolutely believe that it's probably 3 million people, 2 billion people around the world, in particular the United States. We have 3 million farmers that steward 48% of the land mass in the United States of America. And if you care about land, air, and water, I have a feeling that they have continued to get the job done, and they're going to get it done in the future. But they need to be included in the solution set, and they need to be at the table. And they're also probably the best boots on the ground actors to go get it done. So I often go outside of agriculture to say that we are not only the sector that can disrupt the current carbon cycle, reduce the footprint to a net zero economy very quickly and more affordably, but we also have a unique handprint in our society. We enable rural vibrancy. We enable nourishing tables. We enable communities. And so when you invest in this sector, and we are seen as the solution, as a diverse solution set, we can be a sector that does a lot of different things. And so I always, come at it from include agriculture in your diverse solution set.
And I would add, I have the honor of sitting with Together We Grow, which is an industry-led effort to convene diverse partners around the issue of diversity and inclusion. And particularly recognizing that to drive the kind of innovation any of us needs to succeed as universities or businesses, let alone to feed the world, which is the other thing we're responsible for, that we're going to need to have a lot of diversity of thought to drive that kind of innovation. And so I do think that there has been a broad degree of collaboration within the industry to connect not just amongst the industry partners, but outside of industry to think about, we're really one microcosm of this huge thing that our country is really struggling with. And if we can have that kind of leadership within this industry in a collaborative way, where else can we resonate that out to? Because we touch so many other parts of the economy and communities. The next question, or would anybody like to share what their tables have been discussing, what we can do in this room?
Oh, it's a real
You're
mic.
truly a mic runner.
Thank you. I have more of a question. It's potentially a little bit provocative, but so the three pillars of wealth are land, capital, and labor. And the United States was settled by taking land away from Native Americans through the acquisitions through the Mexican-American War. Agriculture was built on the back of slavery. So essentially the people that we're talking about in terms of inclusiveness and equity are the people who the system intentionally deprived of those assets that generate wealth. What do we need to do to balance that? I mean, having inclusive boards and those are good steps, but do we need to do more? Because that was a really big push that continues in some ways today. How do we reverse that?
I love your question, because one of the things we've been talking about is how if we don't sit in uncomfortable seats and have uncomfortable conversations, we're not going to be moving the needle at all. So would any of you like to start by answering that question?
Yeah, so, I know this doesn't, it's not enough, but I know, from what I understand, this started off today with a land acknowledgement, right? So I think it's, like I talked about, small, consistent steps, but also understanding that history too. A lot of times when we talk about, we don't want to talk about it. We don't want to talk about racial relations. We don't want to talk about the struggles or challenges underrepresented groups have. But I think a lot of times, though, and I repeat this is my motto, we have to be comfortable being uncomfortable. A lot of times people, I come across conversations and people are unaware. And we choose to be unaware. We don't deal with things because it doesn't affect us. When I'm out recruiting students, a lot of times they say, hey, I don't want to go to that. My grandmother informs me about what happened. But we have to recreate that narrative. Respect the past, understand the past, but also talk about opportunities too. So again, it's about not dismissing what happened, talking about it, acknowledging it, and also showing empathy for it as well. And that's what I always do. I give a platform or a place or a space for people to have those conversations. And I always say this, a lot of times, we think you got to have the answer. We don't have the answers in this work. But it's understanding it and acknowledging that, and I appreciate your question, definitely.
I think we talked last night too, though, about how do we attract people back into the sector? Like, how do we attract the diversity into the sector, that these are amazing jobs. You can be a farmer wherever you are. We have so many new farmers that are coming back into agriculture that are first-time farmers. And, you know, where does, you know, we've never looked at that, but there's diversity. And there's an increased amount of women farmers that are coming on the scene. So how do we make this sector really not just have that footprint, but that handprint? It does have an incredible opportunity. And then I think about climate change in particular, that it will affect marginalized society. And if we already think we have problems, likely it's going to impact, and we start then talking about environmental justice, social justice, and food justice. And that is at the intersection of food and agriculture. So all of these questions, to me, I think that's the privilege and responsibility of our sector, that it's really at our dinner tables where we're witnessing history, economics, social fabrics. Our sector, compared to any other sector, is the sector that holds all of that unique tension. And we shouldn't be afraid to have that conversation. It's actually a really unique part of our legacy, and probably the most coolest part of our future in solving some of these problems. So we should embrace this and go for it and make that part of that inclusive dialogue of our social fabric, that handprint that we have in society.
I'll just add, as you think about from an employment perspective, because that is what can change the trajectory. So we have a number of different partnerships with under-resourced communities, with students who are in high school in particular, where they can do an internship during the school year. They get paid, as well as have a pathway into a future potential within an organization. When I worked at Wells Fargo, we serve so many different communities of all different economic backgrounds. And if you're looking for a great read and kind of helpful to understand under-resourced communities, there's a book called Bridges Out of Poverty. And so we did a lot of training using the curriculum from Bridges Out of Poverty. So how do we best serve our customers who are coming from under-resourced backgrounds? When we hire from under-resourced communities, how do we best communicate, coach, develop, help bring people along? And it was powerful to do that learning and have our leaders better understand where may be some of those gaps, because I may be looking at it from a different socioeconomic lens. So I think that's a piece of it too, is that employment, you know, how do we help people get up and out of the under-resourced communities?
Philomena, could I ask you really quickly to talk about the desire that the people who are coming to your organization, what are they seeking out of an employer? Are they looking for an employer who is walking the walk or talking the talk and walking the walk when it comes to some of the issues?
Oh, yeah. So I think the world has changed in the employment proposition from back in my day. Out of college, my parents' expectations were get a job, get enough money, and move out of the house, right? And so that was kind of it, being in a big family, like get your degree, do this, right? And so now, even as I look at my 3 kids and look at as we're out recruiting, you know, the piece is, you know, for many, not just students right out of college, you know, the whole continuum, looking for that connection to purpose. And we've talked about that a lot today. What is your organizational purpose, and what does that mean? Ours is feeding human progress. Your commitment to social responsibility, so don't just tell me what you're doing, but why are you doing it, and what's the impact of what you're doing? So that's huge, right? Authenticity, and there is a new expectation that employees are looking for their organization to take a stand on issues that matter. So when things are happening, right, in our local communities, in our nation, what does our organization do? What do we say? You know, so that we can put a stand in the water for people with disabilities. We just completed for the very first time the Disability Equality Index. We participate in the HRC Equality Index. So that's a way that organizations can say, not just do we have a commitment, but we have practices that back it up, right? And so it's been really interesting to see kind of this different expectation. And I think all organizations are trying to figure out, you know, how do we do this? And where do we step in and take a stand? When do we step back? And so it's a very different world.
All right. Do we have a next question? Or we are really interested in the conversations you guys had, so if anybody would be willing to share, we would love to hear what you guys have been talking about. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and turn it over for Q&A. All right, let's go ahead and get started.
Awesome. So farming in the U.S. has been called the widest profession, and access to land has been one of the greatest challenges to diversity and equity. What are your ideas for increasing access to land for Black farmers?
I'm new to ag, so I'm going to defer to these two experts.
We were talking about this a little last night. So I think part of it is really just making certain that it's seen as a viable career. So, and we were talking as well about it's not just the notion of a career, but also what happens after 5 p.m., like creating that culture in the community that this is a great community. This is a great business opportunity. This is the place where we welcome everything. And I think we have to make certain that we are getting new people in agriculture. And also, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be a farmer. We need engineers. We need flight experts. I mean, when I say that, people are probably like looking at like I'm crazy. But we want to eliminate actually these guys that are doing crop dusting and going under. It's the most dangerous profession in agriculture, right? We need drone masters. That's a different type of person that is coming onto our agricultural lands. And we can, because the agricultural jobs are now changing so rapidly, the types of jobs, we can attract a lot of new talent into this sector, and let's embrace it. This is the moment to get, I would say, rural vibrancy and all types of different thinkers and diversity in agriculture.
Yeah, I would also add that, we always talk about a pipeline issue, but I think it's important for collaborations to happen between our institutions of higher education and for our farmers that currently exist. We got to have on-the-farm experience, right, and put people in situations at an early age to be able to do this. So that involves also collaborations with organizations such as 4-H and Youth Development, FFA. We got to get people actually out there doing the work, right, and learning a little bit about it too. And I think about my experiences, again, how I got into the ag and natural resource field was a recommendation by a farmer within my community. And I think a lot of times as we talk about representation, it's important to see folks that look like us, but also it's important to have a mentor or a sponsor. And I think about it, some of the most, the most important folks that I've had, the most influential folks that I've had throughout my career has also been folks that don't necessarily look like me too. So I think, it's the pipeline issue, it's collaborations, and also access and opportunity and somebody vouching for you too. And then also, once you get people that are interested in that, having, education on how to go about, financing your farm or where to actually acquire land. Simple things such as that. And that's coming from my ag economist background. So.
All right. So as you work on sustainabilities, which is the greatest challenge of our time, who isn't at your table that needs to be there for real innovation? And this is directed to you, Erin.
Well, obviously it's any organization that I forget who says this quote. Any leader who's willing to step up at this time, right, is the leader I'm looking for. And so it's any organization. You might find that it's amazing the phone calls we get. I'm like, that's fantastic. Okay, awesome. Go do it. You might find that you have something that can be offered to our organization. We have communicators, we have scientists, we have bankers, people that are kind of coming to the table with their signature strength and like, let's do it. So if you want to get involved, I'm on that question, whoever asked it or anyone, happy to entertain.
Thank you, Erin. This work can sound threatening when it comes from an organization. How can a farmer who doesn't have a leadership mandate and doesn't trust the organizations promoting DNI work be a part of this movement?
Just diversity and inclusion.
So, again, I think trust happens over time, and I think about it, when we have folks that we, at higher education institutions, I'm gonna take it from that perspective, people trust us by sending their children to our institution. And different things may happen over time, that somewhat make us question that trust. But I think also what we have to do is understand where people from those groups come from, but also know that we got to continue to tell our story and tell it in a positive way on the things that we're doing. You know, I always say this, you know, when I was growing up, you know, with my father, you know, I can do all the great things in the world, but if I do that one negative thing, that encompasses everything else that I do. So I think what we need to do is be consistent in our messaging, consistent in our efforts, and understand that, you know, it may be in distrust initially, but that we're working and we're on a journey to get better.
And I'll add, at Land O'Lakes, what we've been trying to do when we bring in our co-op farmers, and they come for professional development or discussion or meetings from all around the country, integrating in some learning and opportunity for them to have a conversation. And so, for example, I was just invited in, we had a group of 150 new leaders within our co-op, and we did a session around intergenerational learning. And it was powerful. It was a workshop based, so they had the opportunity. I snuck in a little DNI, like traditional DNI, and kind of the why and some kind of overall learning around culture and dimensions of diversity, and then picked a topic that I felt would be a safe one, a good one for them to step into, but powerful for them to think about, you know, as they're hiring people, how do they, you know, what are some of those unique differences amongst the generations? How do you transfer knowledge from one generation to another, right? What are some of those things that are unique with Gen Z versus millennial versus X versus boomer versus traditionalists? And it was amazing, the level of conversation that they had in that meeting as a start. Then the next time we bring them together, we're going to, guess what, go with the better, you know, a topic that's going to get them along the journey. So I think, you know, the piece is, how do we start? How do we engage in conversation and create an environment where people feel safe to ask questions? Because a lot of the sessions that I lead from a learning, I will have leaders say, you know, I have questions about this, or the rules have changed, and how do I maneuver in this world today that is very different from how the world has historically been?
Yeah, I was originally struck by that question, by this word mandate, and was reflecting on some of your guys' comments as well on the panel, that you have to do the right thing. And so you don't necessarily need a mandate. It's get started. There's this concept of an entrepreneur. We often hear about extrapreneurs that disrupt from the outside the market. But an entrepreneur is someone who takes on their organization, whatever board that farmer's on, and asks the question, like, maybe we should have a diversity and inclusion conversation. Maybe we should invite different people into these boardrooms. And get started. You know, it doesn't have to be a mandate. Who would that mandate come from anyways? It comes from you.
So we are super excited back here because we received our first question from Twitter, and I'm excited because it's the best handwriting I've seen because it's typed. So hello, Jeremy. And he's asking, from your perspective, how do we increase the number of underrepresented professionals in the agricultural field?
Quentin, you start with MANRRS.
Yeah, so I would say, you know, again, you know, we have a lot of different organizations that focus on agriculture and natural resources, but it's working collaboratively with those organizations. So again, you know, we have MANRRS, we have 4-H and youth development, we have FFAs, having people at the table that have an expertise in diversity, equity, inclusion, but also have folks that are at the grassroots level in those respective communities. And then again, to that, what I would say is in College of Ags and Natural Resources, allocating resources toward diversity, equity, inclusion, and outreach efforts. That's one of the things I appreciate about Michigan State is that we do, again, have 3 pre-college outreach programs. And then also diversity, equity, and inclusion, and who's not at the table is a part of every one of our conversations. So I think it's being intentional in our outreach, having representation, and also using inclusive language. So again, when we talk about people, you know, in positions and roles, a lot of times we exclude in the words that we use. And I'll give an example. A lot of times we refer to a chairman as a chairman, right, instead of a chairperson. So when we think about that, you know, those are small things that we can do to create that inclusive environment.
I'll add that a piece of it is exposure. So kind of that if I see it, I can be it. So we have a number of different high school groups, come to Land O'Lakes, our corporate headquarters, from under-resourced high schools that have no connection to ag, no connection to really understanding the industry. They're a part of learning programs through Step Up, Best Prep, etc. And then what we do for those events is we invite leaders from our different employee resource groups that represent the student communities. So that way they can not only learn about Land O'Lakes, what could be career opportunities, they hear from people who look like them. Because so often, you know, when people will say, when I look up, do I see someone like me? I maybe don't have anyone in my family who works in this ag industry, but now all of a sudden I hear from someone who has a cool career story, and I learn like ag is tech, right? Ag is all these different positions that I don't think people understand. So I think that that is a powerful way, and then they can go back and say, okay, now what do I need to do academically, or, oh, this motivates me to finish high school because now, you know, there could be a different career path that I've never seen.
Yeah,
Sorry. Philomena, will you just explain for the audience what employee resource groups are in case people aren't familiar?
Oh, sure. So if you're not familiar, many organizations have what are called employee resource groups. So they're formed around different dimensions of diversity. So at Land O'Lakes, we have 10. So, for example, Asian affinity, amigos, African American, women, veteran, LGBTQ. We have a young professionals network, and then our experienced workers were like, what about us? So we have an aging successfully, and a disability group looking at the seen and unseen disabilities. So they help us. They have 4 focus areas: recruitment, helping us recruit, retention, community engagement, and also business insights. And so it's a way. I'm a department of 2.2, supporting an organization of 10,000. And guess what? I have people all across the country that are engaged in our employee resource groups, so they can help us all across the country be engaged in the local community as well as at their location.
Thank you. Go ahead, Erin.
No, I was just going to say, I think we just need to make our sector really inclusive. There's a new group called the Farmers Veterans Coalition that was just talking to you about last night. And it really started because a bunch of veterans were coming back and suffering from PTSD and reaching out to farmers to get on the land. And then they created this farmer mentor network of other farmers that were now encouraging veterans to come back on their land. And to me, that story was so powerful. It's on our podcast. You can go listen to it. Like, here's a sector that clearly does need help. And they're not in the ag sector, but agriculture has the potential to, again, be part of that handprint and contribute to this other sector that really needs our help in a way that I never would have ever expected. And so we need to maybe extend our mindset of what is agriculture, and just be open to all these different possibilities of who we might connect with, both diversity of thought and diversity of all sorts of things.
So I have a specific story to kind of gear toward that question. So, you know, I have a brother, older brother, and, you know, we used to talk ag and natural resources all the time. But then when time came, you know, initially I had a nephew that was in 10th grade. And I said, you know, we have a junior MANRRS portion, you know, available for him. And he was like, convince me on this. And that's what I think a lot of times within our underrepresented communities, we have to convince people. I said, well, give me him, and I'll take him under my wing. And what ended up happening, he attended our National MANRRS Conference. And if you have the opportunity to attend our National MANRRS Conference, it's an excellent display of opportunities in ag and natural resources. So for the past 2 or 3 years, he actually went to the National MANRRS Conference. And then his freshman year, he enrolled at the University of Kentucky in agriculture economics. So then, as a result of his participation in MANRRS, he ended up every year he had an internship through one of our industry partners, where he traveled across the country. And then when he graduated recently, he was actually the undergraduate student president of MANRRS too. So when he graduated, you know, I said, which company are you going to go with? Because he had over 5 different offers from all of our different industry partners. And he said, I'm going to go with company X because they have diverse representation in their leadership, and I saw that. So to me, it's important, you know, for our folks to get exposure, but also to have leadership from a diverse standpoint. And now he's 2 years in this role, and he's definitely excelling. And he's thinking about, you know, how to give back to the organization that meant so much to him.
I think we have time for one final question.
Yes, ma'am. So there appears to be a cultural narrative, don't be a farm worker. We increasingly see U.S. citizens bypassing this entry-level job. How do we create pathways into ag that provide for jobs in harvesting produce?
I was just out in California 2 weeks ago with all the California leaders really discussing what's the future of labor in California. And I think both, even for the farmer, it's going to be quite different. So if you imagine how fast we are changing in the last 3 years, in the last decade of ag, I do think if I even talk to my farmers, they're now having become tech specialists, energy specialists, all these types of different types of a businessman or woman, whatever, person. And the farm worker as well, the type of farm worker that will be attracted to these farms is going to be very, very different. Hyper specialized. Some of them are engineers. Some of them, how do you repair my robot? It's a very different type of workforce, and I don't think we always do what I would call workforce planning or strategic planning, and then ask the question of diversity that goes with that. So we've got a lot of work to do, I think, to really imagine the next 10 years in terms of workforce planning and the type of different technologies really that are going to be entering the ag sector and then preparing and backing into that workforce. I think I was talking to the business development of Colorado, and she's from the energy sector, and I said, I always use the example of the wind energy. When they rolled it out, they got together as a co-op and they trained every single employee of the technical colleges to be able to go up and fix a windmill at 600 feet in the air. They had to go teach and build a workforce that could go do that. Are we doing that in agriculture? And there's a lot of lessons to learn from disruption in other sectors that is building that workforce for the future.
Philomena or Quentin, do you want to? No? All right. Would you all thank me join me in thanking, would you all thank me? Yeah. Would you all join me in thanking our panelists for sharing their expertise? And then we'd like to invite Diego back up here because we are going to get a glimpse into the work that Erin's been doing really with this incredible culture change that she is trying to create. Thank you.
Let's give them one more round of applause for the outstanding discussion they had. So later this afternoon, we will host a panel session exploring innovative approaches for building resilient and sustainable food systems capable of feeding a growing population. The U.S. Farmers and Ranchers Alliance is leading an effort that features farmers as the change agents in this conversation. We'll begin with a video, and then Ms. Fitzgerald will share more information with you.
To be honest, I don't know where to start. I was 6 when I knew what I wanted to be. You're only 2 now, but sometimes, I swear, I can already see it in your eyes. It was your granddad who got me into it. Put me in charge of my own acreage at 16. Boy, I had so many ideas. Heck, I was pretty confident about what I was doing. The innovations, truly becoming more and more sustainable. I felt like I was on a mission. And if I'm really honest, I still can't fully wrap my head around how it didn't work. But now we're here at a point where continuing just doesn't make sense anymore. Your mother and I are selling the farm, every single acre. We talked to the bank and the realtor. It's going up tomorrow morning. And we're just gonna move to the city because it'll be a brighter future. and I want you to understand why. It's not just the drought getting worse every year. We were working to stay ahead of that, but costs keep running up and prices keep going down. Then one day you wake up in a place where one bad season can knock you and everyone you care about right over. And that's not a good place. I worry about how much we've invested out here. And at the same time, I can't help but think about what that investment brought us. It used to be nothing but desert here, and now there's so much potential in the soil. But it seems like nobody cares. And that's why we're leaving. I don't want to plant a dream in you only for you to find out later that it's not a living. And that people don't understand, or worse, they don't care. They just blame everything on you. And you start losing your pride. And that's no life. The farm is everything to me, and I want you to know that. But my family means even more. So everything that I do, in the end, it's gotta be for you.
The debate over climate change. Does agriculture have a seat at the table, and are we a part of the problem or part of the solution?
Oh my gosh, I think that we are the solution to climate change. We have not had the conversation that we actually can offset carbon from the fossil fuel sector. And we are cycling carbon. We are biogenic carbon, very, very different from fossil fuel-based carbon.
The potential answer to a lot of our issues is right beneath us in the soil. We've been farming for centuries, and we're just now really learning about the ability of the soil to not only hold water and nutrients, but also sequester carbon and improve our environment. I'm inspired every day by our peers. We monitor our soils with GPS, and we know to the point how to manage our soils.
That's really something, isn't it?
Holding capacity, increase crop productivity, and increase carbon sequestration.
Superheroes.
Our time is now, but we only have about 30 harvest cycles left to get it right. That is more important now than ever. I see the future is bright. We focus every day on
Let's go home.
Yeah.
It's a very exciting time to be in farming because we will be one of the first industries to have a negative carbon footprint.
I just appreciate everyone for letting me play this film. I'll be very brief. 30 Harvest is about the greatest challenge of our time, and it is going to require unprecedented leadership. It is not unlike us traversing the ocean or going to the moon for the first time. It requires that level of clarity and mission-driven leadership. We know more about the moon and Mars than we do know about our own Earth, the Earthshot. And it is going to take every person in this room on this contagious collaboration to really work on fighting climate change. Our farmers hold incredible untapped potential. It's a plant and some soils that eat carbon every day for lunch. That's what our sector does. We're a very cool sector in that we can solve for that. But it will demand and necessitate every farmer to unlock the potential in every single acre, and it's going to take every leader and every voice to make that happen. And this is not a story. 2 weeks after filming, both the farmers in these films, this docudrama, to really grab the attention, were affected by climate change. Megan Kaiser, a soil scientist and farmer in Missouri, couldn't get back into her fields until August 14th. Jay Hill, no one's going to get on film for me, by the way, after this, but Jay Hill was hit by tornadoes and wiped out 5 pivots on his farms. This is real, and the economics of the situation is real. And it necessitates us stepping up and stepping out and fixing the business models of our future. I would argue that it's not the next 30 harvests, that's a chance for agriculture. The next decade does matter. Where are the students in this room? Stand up. Where are you? This is for you. And it's the next, and it's the next harvest seasons that matter the most. The last 2 harvest seasons we've seen on record, this past one, have been incredibly hard for farmers. And if we're not going to lead now, then when? So I'm counting on all of you. We're already up to 1.2 million views in just 3 months to do your part. Any little thing that you can do, to tweet it, to share it. If you're not a tweeter, I'm sure you know someone who is. And just extend a little bit of this story, or talk about it, have a conversation. Many organizations I know are doing what they're calling luncheon views of this film, and having a real conversation about tough conversations. Do I believe in climate change? Do I not? What is this? How is the farm economics? What's my role in bringing food to the table the next 30 years? So with that, thank you for letting me show. Thank you, Colorado, for allowing us to be here and sharing that film. And I'm counting on all of you in this great mission of our time. Thank you.